Hello, everyone. I am the lead instructor, Chen Jiangqian. In this lesson, we will learn the techniques for creating vintage-style portraits. When it comes to portrait photography, whether shot indoors or outdoors, every image can be rendered in a vintage style. Moreover, the vintage look is a timeless approach to tonal and color expression. This is because vintage portraits carry an overall mood of nostalgia, classicism, and elegance, making them universally appealing. Let's begin right now. We will cover the essential post-processing principles for vintage portraits. First, in the ACR basic panel, we apply fundamental adjustments to the image's brightness and contrast. Once the brightness and contrast feel balanced, we move on to adjusting saturation. Typically, vintage and nostalgic imagery calls for slightly lower saturation. Therefore, we need to moderately reduce overall saturation, along with vibrance. The exact amount to lower will vary from one photograph to another. After the reduction is complete, we can then shift color temperature or tint to give the image an overall yellow-green cast. Since vintage, nostalgic styles are predominantly based on yellow-green tones, a simple adjustment between temperature and tint will produce the vintage color palette. It is crucial to note here that if your photograph is very colorful, you may need to lower vibrance and saturation significantly to achieve a vintage feel. Once the adjustments in the basic panel are complete, we also need to enter the color mixer. There we selectively reduce the saturation of certain secondary environmental colors. For example, colors other than skin tones can all be moderately desaturated, even though these colors may not appear in this particular photograph. In more colorful images, we will reduce them. Thus, the secondary colors outside the skin palette should be desaturated more aggressively. Next, we lower the luminance of these secondary colors, making those colors darker, since this image lacks colors outside the warm palette. The changes in brightness and saturation are subtle. Typically, we can also increase the luminance of warm tones, which makes skin tones more radiant. Alternatively, we can slightly adjust skin saturation, including skin hue, shifting it a bit redder or yellower. By adjusting hue, saturation, and luminance in the color mixer, we can easily create tonal contrast between subject and background colors, thereby enhancing the visual hierarchy. This makes the primary subject stand out more clearly. Next, we need to open the tone curve and click on point curve. When creating vintage portrait styles, we typically lift the darkest point in the curve, raising it so that shadows become deep gray, rather than pure black. This gives the shadows a matte appearance. Then we pull the slightly darker mid-tones back down, returning them close to their original position. Of course, each image has its own shadow requirements. You should adjust according to your creative intent and artistic needs. Control the overall tonal balance. We then lift the mid-tones slightly. This curve adjustment is a crucial step in vintage portraiture. It involves raising the black point so that shadows appear matte. They are no longer pure black. If you want even richer tonal variations, we can also add subtle color shifts to shadows, mid-tones, or highlights within the tone curve, giving the image a more nuanced color palette. The techniques explained above are the most common and fundamental for vintage portraiture. Of course, there are countless other methods for creating vintage portraits. This lesson focuses on the simplest, most universal, and most frequently used techniques. That concludes today's lesson. See you in the next class. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Creative Photography Practicum. Today's lesson is a debrief and reflection on our French vintage creative photo shoot. We summarize, review, and reflect on the results achieved through pre-production planning, hands-on practice, and post-production. Through guided practice, the images met our intended goals. The work was refined continuously from capture to final edit. During the shoot, we encountered several issues. Issue 1, the background was too light. We can increase subject to backdrop distance or darken the backdrop. Alternatively, switch to a red backdrop for a moody crimson tone. This adds tonal variation to the background. Issue R, mirror reflections created unexpected light patterns. These reflections delivered unique localized light effects. Issue 3, framing could have included the cinema light to enhance environmental immersion. The mood would have been richer, yet we failed to keep the cinema light in frame. Thus part of the intended atmosphere was lost. Issue 4, the planned glass of red wine was omitted. Consequently, a key storytelling prop was missing. These issues were identified and sorted during the shoot. They reveal gaps in both pre-production planning and on-set execution. Deviation from the original plan led to these shortcomings. Students must keep practicing, master the ability to adapt and solve problems on the fly. Use the brief to craft tighter plans. Continuously elevate shooting skills.